right, I guess it's time. 1:35 p.m. is the start of this breakout session. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jeff Tabares. I'm a research scientist, and I will be presenting my GVRC study, self-reports cortisol reactivity stress in firearms, or stresses for short. Previously or formerly, this study was known as CROSSFIRE, where we didn't have the self-report component. My mentor for this study is Dr. Brian. We both have affiliations with The Ohio State University and the Wexner Medical Center. And within the Ohio State system, we're part of a group called STRIVE. So before I launch into the presentation, just the canned standard spiel to the effect of all verbiage and opinions and things like that are my own, to express and not official positions by any of my affiliations or GVRC. So the other thing I'll put out there, I apologize in advance twofold. I'll be speaking a little briskly in the interest of time. And then, of course, I have horrible seasonal allergies, so I might have the occasional bout of coughing along the way. So that said, we'll just launch right into today's presentation on my study. Oops, right, let me activate this really quick. Okay, there he goes. So before getting in, I just want to thank GVRC and the Ohio Secretary, or part of the my apologies, the New Jersey Office of the Secretary of Higher Education for this wonderful research opportunity. Additionally, I want to thank Angela for all of her coordination that she's done with all of us, the GVRC awardees. And thanks to her help in the coordination, along with GVRC staff, everything has been running very smooth. So huge thanks, and this opportunity is amazing. So a little bit about this study, and as an overview, so this study aligns with preventing gun violence in the form of suicide prevention. And so a little bit more context for overview to get into project stresses in particular. As we've seen in the past year, firearm deaths, over half of them have been suicides. Also very impactful is that psychosocial stressors commonly precede suicide. And within that same cited article there, they gave examples of health reasons as preceding factors at the rate of 13.5%. And that is a very stark contrast to psychosocial stressors, to include intimate partner problems and criminal and legal problems. Now brace yourself. Those impactful rates by comparison are 58.3 and 50.7% respectively. We're also well aware of the fact that there are folks who have acute reactivities to personal stressors that pop up. And in that context, it's not uncommon that these particular authors, Calasan et al., have found that the risk for firearm suicide around those proximal circumstances increased 21 to 29%. We're also aware that suicide risk has very dynamic presentations, such that those two articles indicate that the course of risk for suicide can change within windows of time as brief as 1 hour. We're also seeing various reports within the literature that self-report stress and affect, and even physiologic assessments, so cortisol, for example, have been important tools in helping us understand what the experiential onset of stress could look like. And I know here at STRIVE, we're working with affect and affect changes and regulation, things like that. I can't tip my hand too much about the particulars of those analyses forthcoming, but papers in press and well in preparation there. As far as physiologic assessment, there's a lot of work, particularly with cortisol and reactivity and suicide, done by Daryl O'Connor, University of Leeds. Really fascinating stuff. But now when we take in all of this information, and especially the dynamism, it's well understood that suicide is extremely difficult to detect. And some of the tools we have, or maybe how we're using them, lend themselves to maybe particular circumstances, maybe linear-ish, but as we're finding, there are a lot of nonlinear quirks and things that we're not quite accounting for. So given difficult detection, we have a lot of imprecision in applying timely interventions that could save lives. So given all of that background information, the current study aims essentially to simulate the onset of psychosocial stress so as then to identify differences in stress reactivities between two primary groups of folks, those who either own firearms, in particular handguns, FOs, the abbreviation hereafter, against those who do not own firearms, or DNOs hereafter. And so the working hypothesis that I have for this study is that a difference in stress reactivities will be observed, but admittedly, I don't have a direction as far as like blunted or highly reactive, because it could be the case that folks who own firearms own them for defensive reasons. Perhaps there are things that they've seen over the course of military or police service that makes them believe the world is very dangerous and they need to be protected. So if that's the mindset, then perhaps it could be a chronic stressor that they exist in a very dangerous place. And if that's the case, we might observe a blunted effect with cortisol and the other stress reactivity measures. Alternatively, we could observe, say, high reactive, as we may think. So either way, there may be a difference. I'm just not sure what direction. But the important part is that if we start to understand how there are differences between these groups, especially with the FOs, and we start to understand how firearm owners go through the onset and experience of stress, then we could start picking apart that reaction process, hopefully put together tools and timely interventions in a way that could allow folks to de-escalate that stress and avoid suicide attempts. Because, well, as we saw in the prior slide, that 54% rate is very staggering. All right, so overall, I'm going to need 36 adult participants, and for the most part, the inclusion criteria are also laid out here. So these adults would be US residents residing within either the states of New Jersey or Ohio. And the breakouts of those would be 9 folks who own handguns and 9 folks who do not own handguns. The exclusion criteria are pretty much the opposite, but there are a couple of additional factors thrown in there as well. And in particular, I'm excluding medications that could artificially elevate salivary cortisol. So I guess an example, synthetic glucocorticoids, but also health conditions that could artificially inflate rates of salivary cortisol. So Cushing's disease, PTSD. You'll also notice that there are differential timeframes of engagement. So here I've got New Jersey folks within the hours of 9 to 3, and then Ohio from 11 to 3. And even though I'm not collecting salivary cortisol from New Jersey participants because of logistical reasons, I am still keeping all of the criteria relatively the same, and the procession of data capture is the same as much as I can. But in the case of Ohio folks who I am collecting cortisol from, 11 a.m. is when the cortisol awakening response begins to taper off in a way that upon waking, cortisol is elevated. I don't want to get false high reads on handgun owners and then draw false inferences and conclusions that perhaps handgun owners are high reactive, when in fact, I'm just getting false positives just by biologic course. So another note about power, the sample size was indeed informed by the Trier social stress test, which I'll describe later. That is the paradigm that has been tried and true so as to simulate the onset of psychosocial stress. It has a moderate effect size of 0.65, which I plugged into G-Power along with 4 covariates of interest, and then kind of taking into account repeated measurements and the like. And G-Power indicated I would be able to find differences in stress reactivity with 35 participants. So I added an extra to round out the total group to 36 and keep things even. As far as materials are concerned, during the screening, I'm collecting demographics and a lot of covariate features. So beyond demographics, so age, I believe sex, and I've got history of suicidal ideations and attempts, in addition to perceived stress. So those are all covaried. But then within research activities themselves, I've got 7 data captures that will take place with guess, two particular self-report measures. The subjective units of distress scale is a single item measure of momentary perceived stress that spans on a Likert scale of 0 to 100 to mean least or not at all stressed or anxious to very stressed, very anxious. We have a small modification on the positive negative affect schedule, such that now we're requesting how folks are feeling in the moments that they're, I guess, being questioned or required to self-report. And as you see there on the Ohio side, the key difference is the salivary cortisol collection, which will collect about 0.8 to 1.4 milliliters in a salivette. And as far as procedural overview, things start with recruitment and screening. I've got a paper flyer here, and I've also got Research Match. So that's an NIH-funded project. So it's to help connect researchers with participants, regardless of if folks go through a study by scanning this QR code on a paper flyer, they get in touch with me through Research Match. They'll complete this Qualtrics pre-screening, and should they not meet any hard exclusion criteria, then I'll go into a full eligibility screening with those prospects over the phone, and should they continue to be eligible, then we'll schedule research activities, and then on the day of the activities, they'll perform the Trier social stress test, after which point they'll have a debriefing and incentives on the outset. All right, so now as far as design, just how things are shaking out, I've got two particular independent variables of interest. So participant type is 2 levels, FOs and DNOs, and then I've got time periods, T1 through 7. The dependent variables are going to be the self-reported measures of stress reactivity, in addition to, well, the Ohio folks, a salivary cortisol value. I've got what do you call it, covariates there, age, sex, history of SI, SA, and then perceived lifetime stress. And then the procession of Kleiman's Trier social stress test is laid out here. And essentially what happens during the Trier social stress test is you've got 7 different time points that you'll be able to capture, kind of like baseline pre-stress tasking, and then you'll see it kind of amp up a little in theory. And then you'll be able to see the outset of what happens post-stress procedure. So the contrived stress tasking that will happen, in this case with a TSST in between time points T2 and T3, is that we put participants on the spot. We give them a little bit of a priming that they're going to prepare a speech after the first data collection point. We give them time to prepare. And then at time point 2, then they transition over to the Confederates, who are playing the role of playing the role of communications experts who will record the speech for data analysis purposes. Participants have to perform in front of these folks. And the Confederates will have a flat affect throughout the entire presentation. And then following that speech, then they're put on the spot yet again to perform mental arithmetic, so count backwards from, say, 1,000 by increments of 112 for however long it is until I tell you to stop. After the stress tasking is done, then we have recovery data capture periods there as well. So as far as differences relate to the TSST by New Jersey or Ohio participants, they're pretty much going to be the same. And I will have at least 10 minutes between data captures held consistent. So in the case of Ohio participants, that helps us get differences in salivary cortisol at each time point. But again, I'll keep that relatively consistent even with New Jersey participants as well. Okay, so here's a kind of more of a fine-grained breakout of the tasking. We see here with New Jersey folks, we've got the data collection measures. They're all self-reports. So we've got baseline, and then shortly after the baseline, I will provide the task prompts like, hey, you're going to be preparing a speech. Imagine you're applying for the perfect job, so on and so forth. What kind of qualifications do you think you could bring to bear? That would be that 7-minute interval. And then I would also give them 3 minutes to task prep, at which point, when that concludes, I will get another collection and then pivot the participant over to the volunteer expert confederates who would then assess the performance of the participant. So the other thing that should get folks nervous is that they're also being told that their performance is being recorded when in fact it's really not. So they think it's kind of high pressure when it's not, and they're also debriefed that it's not later. I won't be there during their engagement with the experts. And then after all of this tasking stuff finishes, then I get T3, and then 15 minutes after T3, it's T4, and then the rest of the others till all of the other data captures are completed, then full debriefing and incentives after. So Ohio is pretty much the same, but I also have folks rinse out their mouths before getting that baseline T1 following a 10-minute delay post-rinse. Everything's more or less the same. Here's what our setup roughly looks like. I've got New Jersey meeting up in Zoom, and here we've got a conference room set up with Confederate seating. They've got the arithmetic task solution sheets there, camera and setup. None of this is powered on, but it's angled away from the participants, so they can't see that. And then the proposed analysis that I have again is repeated measures factorial ANOVA, or pardon, ANCOVA. It's a 2x7. We're primarily comparing that 2-level ownership variable with stress reactivity at each of the 7 time points. And then we've got the covariates down there. So just to be clear, all self-report measures will be collected across the board from all participants. However, logistical constraints, Ohio only. More on that later. Another thing I noticed is that some of these self-report measures very well could be kind of commingled together. So stress and affect may go hand in hand. It may very well be the case that this is a multivariate thinking of the outcome, and I'm absolutely willing to explore that possibility as well. And I might even end up reporting that as long as the assumptions for that analysis type are tenable. And if ANCOVA or MANCOVA are not tenable, I also have non-parametric backups to fall back on so as to still answer the same question. Okay, so results, those are pending because data is still ongoing at the moment, but I fully anticipate that any observed differential findings of stress onset between FOs and DNOs, I will try to feedback loop forward into perhaps tools and treatment approaches that we could use to help firearm owners kind of de-escalate for themselves and maintain levels of low risk, hopefully. We have limitations presently. I understand that things are very unbalanced demographically, so I probably won't have the same number of males and females by the time the study finishes. However, my biggest comparison is FOs versus DNOs, and then subsequent studies, I'll balance things out. Additionally, logistical hurdles prevent me from collecting saliva samples from everyone. So the Ohio folks would lend themselves to that analysis. The result may be underpowered, but it might be sufficient for pilot purposes. Lastly, the covariate list isn't comprehensive, but of course, I would be willing to add those into future studies, follow-up things in the future. So as far as future directions are concerned, I've already addressed that, yeah, there are deficiencies that I'll address later in follow-up studies and additional opportunities. But building up this study, I did kind of have the foresight to think about ways to structure data capture in a way that we could start to answer a question in the subfield of suicidology that's been really challenging. And that particular question is, what has changed over time and how have we accounted for it? So there are other types of analyses out there that have been commonly used to assess change, and in particular, multi-stability or catastrophic modeling, in addition to dynamical systems, are analysis types that leverage understanding change and change processes over time. And as I start getting into these analyses more, kind of building off my postdoc training with Drs. Bryan and Butner from the University of Utah, I may very well include other measures that could have import against understanding temporality. So it's my hope that we can apply the synergy of understandings of all these measures in concert and how they rack up against suicide risk in a way to create and implement and then refine timely interventions. And I do apologize if I'm going over. I don't have much left, but this is probably the most interesting stuff. So in order to do these types of analyses, you need 3 data captures minimum to model change. You take that raw data and then you convert it over into a derivative. So in this case, I would probably end up going with a generalized orthogonal local derivative approximation, or GOLD. It's a technique innovated by Pascal Dubuc of the University of Utah. And those transformations would put together 3 types of derivatives. So you've got 0th, 1st, and 2nd, translating to position, velocity, and acceleration. And essentially what you're doing here is you're looking at an outcome of interest relative to something else. So if we start out with suicide risk as a lone construct, and we have the first derivative here on the y-axis and the 0th on the x, and then same here, if we find a negative slope, this would suggest that risk would be stable over time, whereas repulsion is perhaps unstable. Alternatively, if we have the 2nd and the 0th derivative on those respective axes, we could identify perhaps cyclic patterns such that over time, it's not just a one-trick pony trajectory, but you could have particular moments in time where things increase by risk, maybe decrease. And then, so if you know that this is patternistic, where do you start to intervene on this uptick, right? So the other thing that's interesting is cycles can dampen, so they could attenuate over time where the peaks and troughs start to drop off and they're not as pronounced. But that is something we can also examine. So if we're thinking about things in the single variable or predictor sense, what happens when we make the picture more complicated, which very well could be the case in suicide research, right? There's a lot of influences. That's where we get into those ideas I'd mentioned before with CUSP and dynamical systems. So CUSP essentially is you're looking at hard breaks and transitions that are stable. So instead of a number line, you have like a response plane. And in this inset picture, we have 2 phases of stability. We've got low stable here, we've got high stable here. And it very well could be the case that folks with psychosocial stress, as they're amping up, some degree of negative affect, there's some peculiarity here by which there's an abrupt switchover from low stable to all of a sudden now they're high, right? So that's not an uncommon pattern, sudden jumps that we see in the field of, I guess, suicidology. We try to figure out what is that thing in the middle that bridges that jump. So that's also a fascinating question that hopefully this technique can shed light on. Another one is if we have more than, let's say, 3 moderating influences on the outcome of interest, we could put together a multidimensional phase space to look at how, let's say, this is all the response surface for the outcome of interest, so suicide risk. So suicide risk is affected by psychosocial stress, negative affect, legal trouble, lack of sleep, so on and so forth. Then we could end up seeing resulting peaks and valleys of risk pop up along the way. And so over time, what that could look like is we have factors kind of swirling and converging to increased risk. And that could be informative in the sense of, well, what's happening leading to risk? And then how can we de-escalate that, right? So if we've got peaks here, we can also study the valleys. What's happening during these time points that is not high risk? So how do we get people back here, or how do we de-escalate people from high risk back to the valleys to stay stable? It could be that there are subsets of folks that are patternistic. Alternatively, it could be each person has their own map. Interesting work. The last one is also very fascinating in the sense that if we have multiple variables akin to this conceptualization with multidimensional phase space, if we have multiple variables, but they cycle together, right? So it's not just one variable doing a cycle, but you have other variables. So like this is antiphase doing the opposite. Then all of those trajectories circle and swirl together over the phase of the cycle. So the phase of the cycle is here at the bottom, where you've got one full rotation, right? And then we would end up looking at cross-sectional slices of what's happening in this torus form. And within that cross-section, we get to see each of those variable influences as it relates to the outcome of interest, suicide risk. So I do apologize. I know I went way over. Sorry about that. Work is ongoing. I know the preliminary, I guess, items of inquiry to satisfy the grant requirements are also going to be met in the near future, but also rest assured, and I do appreciate the opportunity, but some dynamical systems and custom modeling preliminary work will also be born out of this project as well. So for those of you all still there and interested, I can absolutely field questions as time permits. And yeah, I guess I'll just mute and field